Hello everyone! If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
The morning I turned 40 and fell apart. I woke up on my 40th birthday and cried before I even opened my eyes. Not a gentle, sentimental tear, the kind of ugly, heaving sobs that leave you gasping for air. Because I didn't just feel old. I felt finished. I felt like everything I had ever wanted to accomplish had somehow expired at midnight, like Cinderella's carriage turning back into a pumpkin. Except there was no fairy godmother coming to save me. I was 40 years old, and I had nothing to show for it. Or at least, that's what I told myself. I stayed in bed for 3 hours that morning, staring at the ceiling, mentally cataloging every failure, every missed opportunity. Every dream I had abandoned along the way. I thought about the career I never built. The business I never started. The novel I never wrote. The trips I never took. The version of myself that existed only in my imagination, the one who was brave, successful, fulfilled, and I realized that she was a stranger to me now. She had died somewhere along the way, buried under years of fear, doubt, and the quiet acceptance that maybe I wasn't meant for greatness. Maybe I was just ordinary. Maybe I had always been ordinary. I finally dragged myself out of bed and walked to the bathroom mirror. And I didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. Not because I looked old. I didn't have gray hair or wrinkles or any of the things I had been dreading. It was my eyes. They were empty. Tired. Defeated. I spent the rest of that day going through the motions. I smiled at my daughter when she handed me her handmade birthday card. I accepted Michael's hug and kissed him on the cheek. I ate the cake they had bought me and pretended to be happy. But inside, I was screaming. Because I had spent my entire life believing that by 40, I would have it all figured out. That I would be successful, confident, and completely satisfied with who I had become. And instead, I felt like a failure. A fraud. Someone who had been pretending for so long that she had forgotten what real happiness even looked like. I spent the night lying awake, staring at the dark ceiling, asking myself the same question over and over, is this it? Is this all there is? I was so consumed by my own despair that I didn't notice the sign. I didn't notice the universe trying to send me a message. I didn't notice the tiny thread of hope that was about to pull me out of the darkness and show me that everything I believed about my life, everything I believed about my age, was completely wrong. The thread came in the form of a stranger. A woman I met in the park the very next day. A woman who was 70 years old, and who was about to teach me the most important lesson I would ever learn. The dreams I thought I had lost forever. You know what's worse than turning 40 and feeling like a failure? Turning 40 and realizing you've been comparing yourself to the wrong people for your entire life. That's what hit me the day after my birthday, when I was sitting in a coffee shop, scrolling through social media. Watching all my successful friends post about their promotions, their vacations, their perfect-looking lives. I had spent so many years measuring myself against everyone else that I had completely lost sight of what I actually wanted. I didn't even know anymore. I had been so busy trying to keep up that I had forgotten to figure out where I was going. I looked back at my younger self, the girl who had dreamed of becoming a writer, who had wanted to travel the world, who had imagined a life full of adventure and meaning, and I felt a deep, aching sadness. That girl was gone. She had been buried under years of bills, responsibilities, and the quiet terror of taking risks. I had played it safe. I had chosen security over passion. I had chosen the predictable path over the one that scared me. And now I was 40, and I had nothing to show for it except a life that looked fine on the outside but felt hollow on the inside. I had a good husband, a beautiful daughter, a comfortable home. By all external measures, I was lucky. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had sold my soul for comfort. That I had traded my dreams for stability. That I had become someone I didn't recognize. I remembered the journals I used to keep as a teenager, filled with plans and hopes and wild ambitions. I remembered the way I used to believe that anything was possible. I remembered the fire that used to burn inside me, the one that had slowly, quietly, been extinguished by the weight of adulthood. And I realized, with a sickening clarity, that I had no idea who I was anymore. I was just going through the motions. Wake up, work, dinner, sleep, repeat. Day after day after day. I had convinced myself that this was what adulthood was supposed to look like, that the quiet acceptance of mediocrity was somehow noble. Somehow mature. But it wasn't noble. It was fear. Pure, unadulterated fear dressed up as practicality. I was so scared of failing that I had stopped trying entirely. And that, I realized, was the biggest failure of all. I put down my phone, paid for my coffee, and walked out of that shop feeling heavier than I had ever felt. I had just turned 40, and I was mourning a life I had never lived. I was mourning the person I had never become. And I had no idea how to find her again. But then I walked into the park, the same park I had walked through 100 times without ever really seeing, and I sat down on a bench. And that's when I met her. A woman who was 70 years old, sitting on the same bench, reading a book that would change everything. And she was about to teach me that my life wasn't over. It hadn't even really begun. The woman on the bench who changed everything. The woman on the bench was reading a book with a title I couldn't quite see. And she looked so peaceful that I almost felt bad for sitting down next to her. I was clearly a mess, red-rimmed eyes, slumped shoulders, the unmistakable aura of someone who had been crying in public. But she didn't seem to mind. She just looked up from her book, smiled at me, and said, "Tough morning?" I laughed, a sad, hollow laugh, and said, "Tough life, actually." She closed her book, turned to face me fully, and said something that made my breath catch. She said, "I know the feeling. I felt the same way when I was your age." I blinked at her, confused. "How do you know how old I am?" She chuckled, a warm, easy laugh that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. "Because I've been 42, sweetheart." And I remember thinking that my life was over. That I had missed my chance. That everything good had already happened and I was just waiting around for the end. I stared at her, completely stunned. Here was a woman who looked so happy, so content, so absolutely at peace with herself, and she was telling me she had felt the same despair I was feeling? She said, I spent my 40th birthday crying in a bathtub, convinced I had wasted my life. I had a job I hated, a marriage that was falling apart, and a list of dreams that I had completely abandoned. I thought I was too old to start over. My heart started pounding. But you look so happy now. What happened? She smiled and said, I realized that I was the only one who was stopping me. I was the one who kept telling myself I was too old. I was the one who kept using my age as an excuse. And one day, I just decided to stop. She told me about the years that followed. She told me that at 50, she had left her unhappy marriage. At 55, she had gone back to school. At 60, she had started a small business that she ran out of her apartment. At 65, she had traveled to 3 different countries that she had only ever seen in magazines. And at 70, she was sitting on a bench, reading a book, happier than she had ever been. I felt tears streaming down my face, not sad tears, not overwhelmed tears, but tears of relief. Because this woman was proof that everything I believed about age was a lie. She said, 40 isn't the end, sweetheart. It's the beginning. It's the moment you finally stop caring about what everyone else thinks and start living for yourself. I didn't know what to say. I just sat there, letting her words sink in. And then she said something that I will never, ever forget. She said, the only person who can decide that your life is over is you. And you're still here. So what are you going to do about it? I opened my mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. Because for the first time in years, I didn't have an excuse. I didn't have a reason. I just had a choice. And that choice was going to change everything. The lesson I almost refused to learn. Here's the thing about being 40 and having your entire worldview challenged by a stranger on a park bench, it's terrifying. It's also incredibly inconvenient, because now you can't keep making excuses. You can't keep telling yourself you're too old, too tired, too stuck. Because someone just proved that it's all a lie. I walked home from that park with my head spinning. Every word the woman had said was echoing in my brain, and I couldn't shut it up. 40 isn't the end. It's the beginning. The only person stopping you is you. You're still here, so what are you going to do about it? I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to go back to my comfortable misery, back to my belief that I had missed my chance. But I couldn't. She had planted a seed, and I couldn't stop it from growing. That night, I sat down at my kitchen table with a notebook I had been hiding in a drawer for 10 years. It was the same notebook I used to write in as a teenager, filled with hopes and dreams and plans for a life that I had long since abandoned. I opened it, expecting to feel sad, to feel that familiar ache of loss. But instead, I felt something else. I felt curious. I flipped through the pages, reading the words of a girl I barely remembered, and I realized she had been braver than I was giving her credit for. She had dreamed of becoming a writer. She had dreamed of traveling the world. She had dreamed of living a life that mattered. And she had believed, with every fiber of her being, that she could do it. I closed the notebook and put my head in my hands. That girl was still inside me. She had been buried for decades, suffocated by fear and responsibility and the endless need to be practical. But she was still there. And she was screaming at me to listen. I picked up my pen and wrote something I hadn't written in years. I wrote, "What if I'm not done yet?" And then I wrote a list. A list of everything I had ever wanted to do but had been too scared to try. It was long, embarrassingly long. Page after page of dreams I had abandoned because I convinced myself I wasn't good enough, wasn't young enough, wasn't brave enough. But now I knew the truth. The only person who could decide I wasn't brave enough was me. And I was tired of being that person. I was tired of standing in my own way. I was tired of using my age as an excuse. I showed the list to Michael the next morning, and I watched his face as he read it. He looked up at me with tears in his eyes and said, "Where have you been?" And I realized, in that moment, that I hadn't just been hiding from myself. I had been hiding from everyone who loved me. And it was time to stop hiding. But the biggest challenge was still ahead of me. Because now I had to actually do something with that list. And doing something meant facing my biggest fear of all. The first step I was terrified to take. I stared at that list for 3 days before I did anything with it. 3 days of reading and rereading, of dreaming and doubting, of convincing myself that I was too old and then reminding myself that I wasn't. The first item on the list was simple, but it terrified me more than anything. Write something. Anything. Just start. I had been telling myself I wanted to be a writer for 30 years. 30 years of dreaming, and 30 years of making excuses. I didn't have time. I wasn't good enough. No one would want to read what I wrote. I was too old to start now. But the woman on the bench had told me that she started her business at 60. She had told me that she went back to school at 55. She had proven that age was just a number, an excuse I had been hiding behind for way too long. So on a rainy Tuesday morning, when the house was quiet and my daughter was at school and Michael was at work, I sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop and opened a blank document. My hands were shaking. My heart was pounding. I felt like I was about to jump off a cliff into an ocean that I had no idea how to swim in. And then I started typing. The words came slowly at first, clunky, awkward, self-conscious. But I kept going. I wrote about the woman on the bench. I wrote about my 40th birthday. I wrote about all the years I had spent convinced that I had missed my chance. And then I wrote about the moment I realized I had been wrong. I didn't stop writing for 4 hours. When I finally looked up, the sun had gone down and my daughter was standing in the doorway asking what was for dinner. I had written 6 pages. 6 pages of raw, messy, imperfect words. And I felt more alive than I had felt in years. I sent the piece to Michael, terrified of what he would think. I waited, heart pounding, for his response. And when it came, it was just 4 words, "This is you." Finally. I started crying, happy tears, the kind I hadn't cried in a long time, because he was right. This was me. This was the person I had buried under years of fear and doubt and excuses. And she was still there. She had been waiting for me to find the courage to let her out. But the hardest part was still coming. Because now that I had started writing, I had to face the next fear on my list. And it was even scarier than the first. I had to share my writing with the world. I had to risk being seen, being judged, being rejected. And I had no idea if I was brave enough to do it. But I also knew that if I didn't try, I would spend the rest of my life wondering what if. And I was done wondering. The moment I dared to be seen. You know what's more terrifying than writing something for the first time in 30 years? Sharing it with the world. That's exactly what I did 2 weeks after I wrote those 6 pages. I posted my piece online, a small blog, nothing fancy. Just a place where I could put my words out into the universe without screaming them from a rooftop. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost deleted it 3 times before I hit publish. My heart was pounding so loudly that I could hear it in my ears. I felt like I was standing naked in a crowd of strangers, waiting for them to point and laugh. But I hit publish anyway. And then I closed my laptop and walked away, too scared to look at the screen. I spent the next 3 days in agony. Every time my phone buzzed, my stomach dropped. Every time someone sent me a message, I was convinced it was going to be someone telling me how terrible my writing was. How I should never have tried, how I was too old and too late and too foolish to ever be taken seriously. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't focus on anything except the voice in my head that kept whispering, "You made a mistake. You're going to regret this." But then something happened that I never expected. I started getting comments. Not mean ones. Not critical ones. Sweet, encouraging, beautiful comments from strangers who had read my words and felt something. One woman wrote, "I'm 42, and I needed to hear this today." Another wrote, "You made me cry. Thank you for being brave enough to share your story." And another wrote, "I've been hiding for years. You just gave me permission to stop." I sat at my kitchen table, scrolling through those comments, and I cried. I cried because I had been so terrified of being rejected, and instead, I was being embraced. I cried because I had been so convinced that no one would care about what I had to say, and instead, I was being seen. I cried because the woman on the bench had been right. I wasn't too old. I wasn't too late. I had just been too scared to start. And once I started, everything changed. I started writing every single day. I stopped worrying about whether it was good enough and just focused on showing up. I told myself that I didn't need to be perfect. I just needed to be present. I just needed to keep going. And I did. I started building a community of people who were going through the same thing, people who felt stuck, who felt too old, who felt like they had missed their chance. And every time someone told me that my words had helped them, I felt a little bit more of the old me coming back. The me who believed in possibility. The me who wasn't afraid. The me who had been buried for years, slowly digging her way out. But the journey was far from over. Because the next item on my list was even scarier than sharing my writing. It was something I had been avoiding for decades. Something that would force me to face my biggest fear of all. and I had no idea if I was ready. The small steps that changed everything. Here's the thing about transformation. It doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens in the tiny, unglamorous, everyday choices that no one else notices. After I started writing and sharing my work, I felt like I had climbed a mountain. But I quickly realized that the mountain wasn't the summit, it was just the first step. I had to keep going. I had to keep making those small, terrifying choices every single day. So I did. I started small. I carved out 30 minutes every morning to write, before anyone else in the house woke up. Those 30 minutes became my sacred space, the only time when I wasn't a wife, a mother, an employee, or any of the other roles that had been consuming me for years. I was just me. A woman with a pen and a page and a million things to say. Then I started doing other things I had been too afraid to try. I signed up for a writing class, a real one, with a teacher and assignments and deadlines. I was terrified. I walked into that classroom convinced that everyone would be younger than me, smarter than me, more talented than me. But instead, I found something unexpected. I found people of all ages, some in their 20s, some in their 50s, some even older than the woman on the bench. We were all there for the same reason. We were all trying to find our voice. We were all trying to create something that mattered. I made friends. I found mentors. I discovered that the thing I had been so afraid of, being seen, being judged, being imperfect, was actually the thing I needed most. Because every time I shared my work and someone responded with kindness, I felt a little bit more of the old me coming back. Every time I struggled with a sentence and finally got it right, I felt a little bit braver. Every time I showed up to class even when I was tired and full of doubt, I felt a little bit more like myself. The change was slow. Almost imperceptible. But it was real. Michael started noticing it first. He would come home from work and say, "You seem different. Happier. Lighter." And he was right. I was lighter. I had been carrying a weight for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to put it down. The weight of all those abandoned dreams. The weight of all that fear and self-doubt. The weight of convincing myself that I was too old and it was too late. I was finally putting that weight down. And I was starting to see a future that actually excited me. A future filled with words and stories and connections. A future that looked nothing like the one I had been so desperate to escape. But the biggest surprise was still to come. It came from the most unexpected source, the one person who had been with me through everything, whose opinion I valued more than anyone else's. And when she spoke, everything I had been working towards suddenly made perfect sense. The person who believed in me first. The unexpected surprise came from my daughter. Not my husband, not my friends, not the woman on the bench, my 7-year-old daughter. I was sitting at the kitchen table one evening, hunched over my laptop, editing a piece I had been working on for days. I was frustrated, convinced that everything I wrote was terrible, that I should just give up and accept that I wasn't meant to be a writer. And then I heard her small voice behind me. "Mommy, can I read what you wrote?" I almost said no. I almost told her it wasn't finished, wasn't good enough, wasn't ready for anyone to see. But something stopped me. Something made me turn around and say, "Sure, sweetie. But it's not very good yet." She took the laptop, sat down on the couch, and read my words. I watched her little eyes moving across the screen, her lips mouthing the words silently. And I felt that familiar knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. I was preparing myself for her to say she didn't understand it, that it was boring, that she wanted to go play instead. But instead, she looked up at me with those big, honest eyes and said, "Mommy, this is beautiful. You should keep writing." I felt the air leave my lungs. This child, who had no reason to say anything except exactly what she felt, had just told me that my words were beautiful. She wasn't trying to be nice. She wasn't trying to encourage me. She was just telling the truth. I walked over to her, sat down beside her, and hugged her so tightly that she squeaked. "Thank you, sweetie," I whispered. "You have no idea how much that means to me." She looked up at me and said something that I will never, ever forget. She said, "Mommy, when you're sad, I'm sad too. But when you write, you're happy. And I like it when you're happy." I started crying, of course I did, and I held my daughter and I realized that she had been watching me all along. She had seen me miserable. She had seen me defeated. And she had seen me come back to life. She had been rooting for me the entire time, even when I didn't know I needed rooting for. That night, I wrote in my journal, "My daughter believes in me. She believes I can do this. And if she believes in me, then I can believe in myself." It sounds so simple, but it was everything. Because for years, I had been telling myself that I wasn't good enough, that I was too old, that it was too late. But my daughter didn't see any of that. She just saw her mother trying to do something brave. And she loved me for it. I closed my laptop that night and felt something shift inside me. I wasn't just writing for myself anymore. I was writing for her. I was writing to show her that it's never too late to chase your dreams. I was writing to show her that courage isn't about being fearless, it's about being scared and doing it anyway. I was writing to show her that you can always, always start again. And when I woke up the next morning, I didn't feel like a failure anymore. I felt like a woman with a purpose. A woman with something to say. A woman who was finally, after all these years, ready to live. But the biggest change was still to come. The change that would make me realize that everything I had been through, every moment of doubt, every tear, every sleepless night, had been preparing me for something I never could have imagined. The change I never saw coming. I want to tell you about the moment everything clicked into place. The moment I realized that all those years of fear and doubt had been preparing me for something I never could have imagined. It happened about 6 months after I started writing, when I received an email that made my hands shake so badly I almost dropped my phone. A small online publication wanted to publish one of my pieces. Not just any piece, the one about turning 40. The one about feeling like my life was over and realizing I was wrong. They wanted to share it with their readers. I read the email 3 times, convinced I was hallucinating. Then I called Michael, and I couldn't even get the words out because I was crying too hard. He said, "Baby, what's wrong? What happened?" And I just kept saying, "They want to publish me. Someone wants to publish me." He started crying too, and we just stood there on the phone, sobbing together like two idiots in love with a dream we never thought would come true. When I finally hung up, I sat down on the floor and let myself feel every single emotion that had been bottled up inside me for decades. The fear. The doubt. The shame. The hope I had been too scared to admit I still had. And then something shifted. All that pain I had been carrying, all those years of believing I wasn't good enough, it didn't disappear. But it transformed. It became part of my story. It became part of my voice. I realized that I hadn't wasted those years. I had been living them. I had been growing, learning, becoming the person who could finally write the words that mattered. The woman on the bench had started her business at 60. I had started writing at 40. And now, I was about to be published. I thought about all the people who had told me I was too old. All the people who had made me feel like my time had passed. They were wrong. So incredibly, beautifully, undeniably wrong. My time hadn't passed. It had just begun. The piece was published 3 weeks later. I read the comments from strangers who had been moved by my words, who had felt seen and understood, who had finally felt permission to chase their own dreams. And I realized that this was the whole point. All those years of struggle, all those years of feeling invisible, they hadn't been for nothing. They had been preparing me to help other people feel less alone. I wasn't just a writer anymore. I was someone who could reach into the darkness and pull someone else into the light. And that, I realized, was the most beautiful thing I had ever done. But the final lesson was still to come. The lesson that would make me understand, once and for all, that 40 wasn't the end of my life, it was the beginning of everything. And it came from the person I least expected. The woman I found at 40. Do you want to know what happened when I finally stopped being afraid? I didn't just start writing. I started living. I started saying yes to things I had been saying no to for decades. I started traveling, small trips at first, weekends away, then longer journeys to places I had only ever seen in magazines. I started meeting people who inspired me, who challenged me, who made me believe that the best years of my life were still ahead of me. I started believing it myself. The woman on the bench had told me that 40 wasn't the end. She had told me it was the beginning. And she was right. I was 42 years old now, and I had never been happier. I had never been more myself. I had never felt more alive. I had published dozens of pieces. I had built a community of readers who connected with my words. I had found a voice that I had buried for decades, and I was finally letting it speak. But the most beautiful part of this story is not what I achieved. It's who I became. I became a woman who wasn't afraid anymore. A woman who knew that failure wasn't the end. A woman who understood that the only person standing in her way was herself. A woman who had learned, through all the tears and the doubt and the sleepless nights, that she was enough. exactly as she was. At every age. At every stage. I thought about the day I woke up on my 40th birthday and cried because I thought my life was over. I had been so wrong. My life hadn't been over. It had been waiting for me to show up. And I finally did. I thought about my daughter, who had believed in me before I believed in myself. I thought about Michael, who had loved me through every dark moment. I thought about the woman on the bench, who had planted a seed that grew into an entire forest. And I realized that I wasn't just lucky. I was brave. I had made a choice. I had chosen to stop listening to the voice that told me I was too old, too late, too scared. I had chosen to start living my life instead of just surviving it. And that choice had changed everything. If you're watching this video and you're standing at the edge of your own 40th birthday, or 50th, or 60th, and you're afraid that your best years are behind you, I want you to know something. They're not. Your best years are not behind you. They're ahead of you. They're waiting for you to show up. To take a chance. To believe that it's never too late to become who you were always meant to be. I thought my life was over at 40. I was wrong. I was so beautifully, completely, wonderfully wrong. And I have never been happier to be wrong about anything in my entire life. That's all for today. I'll make more similar videos in the future. Don't forget to subscribe to see them.